Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. Today is July 20th, 2018. And tonight's topic is the difference between Russia's gold and Russia's treasury holdings. Before we get into that, let's check out the markets today. Gold and silver both had up days, follow-through rallies, I would say, from the immediate reaction that they both had to Donald Trump's comments about the Federal Reserve raising rates. When he mentioned that he was concerned about that yesterday, the gold and silver prices bursted off of their lows. I think gold was down in the low 1220s. Silver was down almost to the low 15s. It was not quite $14.99, but it was headed in that direction. I think silver was as low as about $15.12, and gold had been about as low as $12.12, maybe, not $12.22. They both bounced off of their lows when Trump made the comment, and then they drifted lower. Today, Trump was at it again, and he was expressing concern, as was Treasury Secretary Munchkin. I always call him Munchkin because I can't pronounce his name. Concerned that the Fed would raise rates, and Trump was mentioning that he was concerned that they would raise rates twice more this year. Now, I've seen news reports saying that the president has been spoken to and told that the Fed is an independent agency. Well, I'm sure he knows that, but that doesn't mean he likes that. As we talked about last night, Richard Nixon had issues with his Fed chairperson, who he believed he had appointed, in a sense, to do his bidding in terms of monetary policy, Arthur Burns. And in Arthur Burns' diary, he mentions how Nixon would tell him what to do. And that kind of destroyed Arthur Burns' view of what the independence of the Fed was supposed to be. He thought it was something where he could apply his economic knowledge and conduct monetary policy without interference from the president. But welcome to the world of politics with Richard Nixon. Now, similarly, I don't know if Donald Trump is going to summon Jerome Powell into his office. I think that would be unprecedented, but you never know. And you can't assume that the Fed is 100% independent, given that they are political appointees. But in any event, that's why the gold and silver prices had a second rally today. Gold and silver started off at about 15 and a quarter. It had fallen yesterday. It had gotten as high as 15.40, but it had fallen back to 15 and a quarter, and it rose up to 15.55 today. So it was a pretty big day for silver. It rose about 1.5%. It actually outpaced gold today for the first time in a long time. Gold also got its second win today in the middle of the day, and it rose, and it closed at the high of the day at 12. The high of the day was 12.32. It closed at 12.31.30. So both gold and silver had a follow-through rally based on the jawboning of the Treasury Secretary and the President about the state of the dollar. Now, it's possible going forward Jerome Powell raise or not raise rates based on what he wants to do, and all they can, when the president or a Fed chair or whoever jawbones, that doesn't last very long. They have to actually back the policy with what they're saying. Just like when the Fed kept talking about tapering or talking about raising rates, at some point they stop listening until they do. So unless we see the Fed hold off on raising rates in the coming months and actually at the press conference explaining that they're not going to because they're concerned about choking off the recovery, which is a valid concern, and generally the Fed overshoots its mark on both places. They generally are late to knowing that there is a recession, and they keep raising rates when one has already started, and they don't start cutting rates in time. So perhaps they've already overshot their mark, especially given that the rest of the world The rest of the world is still in a tightening cycle, still at negative and zero interest rates for the most part. And now you have, besides the ECB at zero, Bank of England at zero, Japan negative, all doing QE, you now have China devaluing the yuan or allowing it to go lower. And meanwhile, if the view on the dollar is it's all full speed ahead, continue to raise interest rates, that's just going to fuel further dollar strength. And that all, when it comes down to, that impacts the price of gold and silver, because especially gold trades a contra to this the price of the dollar. So gold and the dollar are somewhat negatively correlated. Silver somewhat follows gold, but also has a life of its own due to its lack of monetary value and more on its industrial demand. Let's take a look now at what happened with the cryptocurrencies. Last few days, they've drifted a bit lower. They had a big surge earlier in the week. Bitcoin is at about 73.50, Ethereum 450. Bitcoin had risen today to about 7,600. Ethereum earlier in the week had topped 500. Bitcoin cash down to 767. It had also been over 800 earlier in the week. Litecoin at 82.70. That had reached 92 earlier in the week. So they've all drifted back down. No impetus for them to rise at the end of the week. No real new news. All right, let's take a look at the difference between Russia's gold and Russia's treasury holdings. So today I reported on Russia's gold reserves. I do it every month. I go to the website, the Russian bank, the Federation of the Russian Central Bank, and they report on their they put out a spreadsheet on their financial position. And in that they include their overall reserves and their gold reserves. So when we talk about Russia's gold, we're talking about the gold that's at the Central Bank of Russia, the Federation of the Central Bank of Russia, and they've been adding gold for the last, since 2006-07. Before that, they had been selling gold, and they've accelerated their pace the past few years. So when we talk about the Russian Central Bank, their gold amount is about 1,944 tons after today's announcement of adding another 500,000 ounces. That's about 15.5 tons. Last year, they added about 224 tons, and since 2015, they've added about 646 tons. A lot of gold, but in the overall scheme, it is worth $78 billion. And it's 17% of their overall gold, of their overall foreign reserves. Now, the big story in connection with this is their, quote, dumping of U.S. Treasuries. So let's be clear on what when we say Russia's gold, we're talking about the Central Bank of the Federation of Russia and the gold that they have on their balance sheet. And that is all included, and it includes the gold that they purchase, and generally they get that from their domestic mining supply. And if you go to Smaulgld today, you'll see the top story, or the most recent story. You'll see some charts showing the gold reserves, how they've increased over the past few years. You'll see them how they've increased or decreased over the past 20 years, and you'll see monthly additions, and you can get a sense of what they're doing. And you can also see the Russian reserves, gold reserve additions versus their mining production. And generally the last 3 years, since they're number 3 gold producer in the world, they've been swapping their rubles for gold, buying from their domestic mining production. And the last 3 years, they've averaged well over 200 tons a year of the about 260, 270 tons average a year that they mine. And it seems to be they're doing that again this year. All right, so that's Russia's gold, and that's the gold from the Central Bank of the Federation of Russia. Now, over on the Treasury side, when we talk about Russian holdings of U.S. Treasuries, we are talking about what we get from the U.S. Treasury. They call it the TIC report, and that shows the amount of U.S. Treasuries that are held by country. It's called the top foreign. They have the top foreign holders of U.S. Treasuries, and in that report they show all the treasuries that are owned by foreigners. But those numbers are not all treasuries held by foreign central banks. So when we report on, quote, China's gold, I'm talking about the People's Bank of China, the central bank of China's gold reserves. When I talk about Russia's gold, I'm reporting on the central bank of Russia's gold reserves. When I talk about Kazakhstan, which I'll probably put out tomorrow, I'm talking about Kazakhstan's gold, meaning that which is held at the Kazakhstan central bank. When you talk about how much gold the United States has, we're talking about how much is in Fort Knox and what's at the U.S. Treasury. Big distinction. The Federal Reserve is the only central bank in the world, I believe, that is not held by its treasury. All the other central banks, it's part of the country, whereas the Federal Reserve is a separate quasi-private bank. Even though the president appoints it, it's not part of the government the way the other central banks are. So when we talk about U.S. gold, it's not the gold that's held at... The Fed doesn't hold any gold. That gold is held under the auspices of the Treasury. But when we talk about other countries' gold, we are talking about the central bank's gold. So the Reserve Bank of India will have 557 tons. That doesn't mean that's all the gold in all the gold that's in India. All right. Now, as to the Treasury holdings, there's a distinction you need to understand as well. When we say Russia is dumping treasuries, or China is dumping treasury, or Belgium, whatever it is, those numbers include what's held at the central bank, but also what's held by nationals in Russia, nationals in China, nationals in Singapore, India, wherever they are. So that is based on information that's collected by the Treasury from U.S.-based custodians and broker-dealers. And also, the Treasury notes that the U.S. securities held in overseas custodial accounts may not be attributable to the actual owners. So these are all estimates. They come from the Treasury, and they don't reflect and they don't break out how much the Russian central bank has, how much Russian nationals may have, and so on. So when we talk about what happened recently in that the Russian Treasury holdings have gone down, we have to assume that if they had 96 billion worth of treasuries in March, Russians, not necessarily the central bank, that a good portion of those treasuries were held by the Russian central bank. However, they could also be held by, quote, oligarchs and other entities in Russia, rich individuals or companies. Now, the fact that the Russian holdings of U.S. treasuries, as reported by the U.S. Treasury, have gone from 96 billion in March to 48 billion in April to 14.9 billion in May means that someone, and probably the Central Bank of the Federation of Russia, has indeed sold off those treasuries. So what does that all mean? Well, before we get into that, it doesn't mean that Russia itself, or the Russian Central Bank, doesn't hold dollars anymore. This is their holdings of U.S. treasuries, which would have to be the notes in which they get paid interest on from the government. Their overall reserves, even though they sold from 96 down to 14.9, they did not buy an equivalent amount of gold. No way, not even close. Their gold reserves went up a small amount each month, but they didn't rise. They sold $81 billion. Now think about that. The Russian total gold holdings are worth $78 billion. Russia itself sold $81 billion worth of treasuries in 2 months. So they didn't, it's not like the Russian central bank sold treasuries and bought gold. It's very important to point out. What they probably did, and I can't figure it out from their balance sheet, is they sold the treasuries and they probably converted them in just to dollars. They could have converted them into their own currency, which I don't think they did. They could have converted them into euros Or they could have just, who knows what they did, but the point is they didn't cash out $80 billion worth of treasuries and go out and buy gold. So their gold acquisition at the Central Bank of Russia is one thing. When they sell treasuries, it's entirely separate. And the last point to make before we get to the comments are that when you have $14 billion worth of treasuries on your balance sheet right now, like Russia does, it's of no consequence to, they could sell that now. It's not going to matter. So it's just important to point out that Russia has reduced its treasury holdings. They may increase them again. You don't know. This could be temporary because they had gotten them down to the 60s just a year and a half ago, and they raised them all the way back up to 108. It could be a temporary thing. We don't know. But it's important to realize that Russia itself is not that important as a U.S. Treasury holder. They currently have next to nothing. We mentioned the other night that Google, Yahoo, not Yahoo, Google, Facebook, and Apple themselves have over $100 billion in U.S. Treasuries. All right, so the important takeaway here is that Russia did not sell treasuries and buy gold. Let's take a look at the comments that we might have. All right, what sorcery is this? Is Joshua Roberts. Veraza says, good night and greetings from the Netherlands, still awake. Here, thanks for your work and report. Oh, well, thank you very much for staying awake to hear it. Remember, you can always capture it the next day or within an hour, but if you're sleeping, you can capture the Smaulgld live casts or live streams the next day. They do get uploaded. Hubzilla. That it can't be used to counter fiat. Gold is atomized among citizens. Another argument in store. Lewis, LOL. We never finished our last argument. We'll have to do them. You can put some comments below this when it gets loaded up. But I'm not saying that fiat is superior. I'm saying that fiat is what we have. And I'm not sure complaining about it does anyone much good, because the awareness of the debt crisis that we could have because of unbacked fiat currencies, I don't think is going to convince anyone. So the question is, what do you do when you're in a fiat system? Do you just complain about it, or do you try to understand the fiat system rather than saying, I don't want to understand, I don't like it, it's no good, and if everyone was just on gold, it would be better off. There's issues with the gold standard too, but we can have that discussion in the comments. Now, Veraza, I believe the Fed will keep hiking, will force the hand of other central banks as well. Well, that's possible that they want to raise rates. My view is that they coordinate this, that the U.S. is probably close to the end of its hiking cycle anyway, and what they want to do is probably get interest rates maybe up to 2.25, and leave them there and stop raising them, and then give the ECB, which they've already said like 2019, around then they can start raising their rates, and then see how it goes. Go a couple of years of slow rate hikes by the other foreign central banks, and then if there's a recession, then the Fed can start lowering rates, and they'll be in a position where the Fed's lowering rates while the other central banks are raising them, and that's how they'll balance out the fiat currency system. Faraza, they will find a way to lower the dollar they've done in the past. Yes, I mean, one way to lower the dollar would be not just to stop raising interest rates, but would be to announce that they are going to stop raising them, but also to announce maybe they may need to cut rates, and that would they can jawbone that as long as they're not still raising rates. I mean, you can't be raising rates and talking about cutting them, but you can stop raising rates and talk about cutting them, and that you can buy half a year with that kind of thing, because you just don't keep raising them, but you don't lower them, but you say you might, and everybody starts factoring in that you're on a rate, you're headed towards a rate cut rather than a continued tightening policy of rate hikes. So that about does it for tonight. Just wanted to make sure that people realize that while Russia is, quote, dumping treasuries, it's not the central bank. It's partially, and maybe even all of it, but I doubt it's all. But they're not dumping treasuries to buy gold. Thanks for... Oh, we got another comments. Any comments to X22 that the Fed subtly deflates stock market to get money transferred to support bond market? Didn't see that comment. Haven't thought about it. I'll have to get back. Oh, yesterday was the third Thursday of the month. Pad says, which is typically the end of contract. That's why gold may have bottomed. Had nothing to do with Trump's speech. That's possible too. Although they did coincide. You can see on both charts yesterday and today when Trump made his comments, the prices reacted immediately at that point. In both cases, you can see if you take a look at the Kitco charts on the 19th and the 20th, you see a straight spike up and then you see a leveling off after that. Whereas what if they stop hiking? What excuse will people buy? Doesn't that mean the talk of how great everything is simply not believable anymore? That would drop the dollar. You know, they can spin anything any way you want it. You raise rates because you're trying to control inflation because the economy's spiraling out of control and things are great. You stop raising rates because it's Goldilocks. Everything is just right. Now we want to allow, I can hear them saying it, allow the tax cuts to do their magic. Monetary policy no longer needs to be tight, no longer needs to be loose, and they can, you know, let it set that way. So what would give the markets a bad taste that something is wrong if they start not just not raising rates, as we talked about a few minutes ago, but also talking about cutting. And then they say, whoa, 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 why do you need to cut rates? But I think what they would do is if they wanted to keep the dollar not from falling, just keep it where it is and maybe let it drift a little lower, maybe they'll miss a rate hike at the next meeting and maybe give ambivalent guidance as to whether they're going to raise rates or not. And that will balance everything out. And I think that they coordinate these moves and these meetings with the other central bankers. They seem to be very well timed and coordinated because in a fiat system, you can't have one currency too high, the other's too low. They're all interconnected. And if you think about it, the central bankers seem to keep everything within a range. Now, the outlier is this tariff thing. If Trump goes through with $500 billion in tariffs, it looks like China says, I don't care about the World Trade Organization, or I don't care about being called a currency manipulator. We have to make up that value. And if we're going to get slapped with tariffs and it's going to cut off our revenue, we're going to have to, in a sense, lower our prices by devaluing our yuan to make up the difference. Who knows how high they'll let that go? Will it be 7 or 8 to the dollar? Who knows? But it's gone up dramatically. And so we'll just have to see what happens. That is the wild card. The tariff thing is a very big wild card. Database DNA, there was an unusual rise in the 10-year rate right about the time Russia was selling. Do you think this accounts for the move? No. Because that was in April and May, and I don't think the amounts were big enough. I know on Zero Hedge he's saying that was the reason. I just don't think the amounts were big enough. Pad, Charles Nenner, there is no free will in the markets. I agree it's orchestrated in advance. I think it's become more and more so since, I was going to say 9/11, but I mean, I guess the financial 9/11 in the end of 2008 to 2009. Ever since then, I think they've massively coordinated. I think they used to loosely coordinate, but I think now all the central banks work on policy integration. Veraza, thank you for asking. You're right about coordination. I don't doubt that for a second. I don't think they can keep inflation in check, though, but they can't hike that much given the debt. Well, the interesting thing with the inflation is it's possible that everything that they've done, even though we have a level of price inflation, is there was a lot of deflation that should have happened in deleveraging that they didn't allow to happen. And they also brought a lot of demand forward through the stimulus. So in a sense, it all washes itself out. And that's why you don't have massive hyperinflation, because everything they did counteracted the fact that there should have been a deflationary period. When we had the crash and all that debt went belly up, that should have been a deflationary depression. What they did was they reflated it, and to give the appearance that the economy was still functioning because you didn't have a massive deflation. That's why the central bankers are always for inflation. They view it as somehow helpful to the economy. It's not always helpful, but I think in their minds it was helpful during the last crisis. All right, Faraz, you got to go to bed. Have a great weekend. Oh, Joshua Roberts, you could almost call it a cartel. Yeah, well, I guess. I mean, you could also call it, if you're going to have a fiat currency system and you're going to have global trade, you can't have pieces of it just imploding. So that's why they definitely, you know, the IMF, and they have these organizations, I think, where they try to coordinate it. And I think what Trump is doing is he's trying to say, well, you know, if China takes it on the chin because of this, so be it, because he's looking at it from a win-win or a win situation, meaning if we can work it out where everybody wins, it's fine. But I think he's trying to say we want to work this out so the United States wins. Yep, tick for tick. Faraz, what are your thoughts on gold, silver, and deflationary times? Yeah, I need to go to sleep. Thanks again. Have a good night. Depends on what the cause of the deflation is. I think if the cause of the deflation is lack of confidence to spend money, then you could see gold and silver do well because they, in a sense, are confidence, because people would rather hold something that doesn't have a counterparty risk, which you might feel you'd have in a situation where there's a lot of defaults and deflation. But if it's just a function of a slowing economy and a reaction to overstimulus, then I'm not sure that helps, unless the understanding is that you think that they're then going to go back and reflate everything and do some more money printing and more lower interest rates. Then the gold and silver would benefit because they'd anticipate that move. Open market negotiations, that's what it is. Joshua, you can obviously see they are trying to undercut MAGA economics. They are doing this in year one and will tamp down the MAGA economics upside. So he is like, hey, wait a minute, fellas, we're doing Syria, North Korea, Iran, stop tanking markets and don't raise it now. Yeah, I mean, he's in the United States, if you think about it, it's hard to coordinate all your policies because you've got monetary policy, which is the Fed, which is supposedly independent. You got fiscal policy, which is done by a Congress, which may or may not be in sync with what the president wants. They could either be a different party, or they could be like they are now. Some Republicans don't agree with the president. And then you've got the president, who has to go along, has to sign the spending bills of the fiscal. And then you have all these international agreements. And see, Trump, by getting out of the TPP and the Paris Accord, gives him more flexibility because he doesn't have to look at those two agreements. But yeah, it's difficult to coordinate a national policy. But you see, China doesn't have as much of a problem because it's one. I think there's like 10 people in China that run everything with the president, and they just set their plan in place, and they probably have an easier job of it. What about the 400 billion the DNC got from Russians? Well, I don't know anything about that. All I know is that Putin mentioned it at the press conference, and then there was really no follow-up, and he didn't give any proof of it, and so no one's reporting on it. I don't know anything about it, and the reason I don't know anything about it is I'm not in a position to find out, and no one seems to be interested in finding out. So it's interesting. That could be. Now, I think if that was a comment that if Putin had said 400 billion had gone to the Trump campaign, we'd know as much about that as possible. But there didn't seem anyone was interested in following up on that story. All right, let's see. Anything else? I want to formally apologize on behalf of Americans we stood by. Well, now you're getting into 1917. I don't know. I don't know much about the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, I know it happened. I know what happened, but I don't know what the other countries' involvements were in allowing or not allowing it to happen. All right. I want to thank everyone for joining me tonight. And if you want to get your mug, I'm going to do another shipment run tomorrow. I'm even doing international shipments tomorrow. I'll leave you the link now. There's your Smaulgld. And if you've enjoyed this, please consider becoming a Smaulgld patron. I'll leave you the link for that one. Or just donate a one-time donation to Smaulgld via PayPal. And you can also donate via Bitcoin and Litecoin, the addresses are on the Smaulgld site. But before I sign off, I'll leave you those as well. And I do want to thank everyone for joining me tonight. And you can join me each and every night at about this time. And here come your Bitcoin and Litecoin. Here they come, addresses. Thanks again, and we'll see you tomorrow.